just north of Kyiv, the aftermath of a Russian attack. Moscow launched over 700 drones and missiles at targets across Ukraine overnight, seemingly confirming that any agreement on a peace deal is still a long way off. Diplomacy has certainly intensified this week, but many Ukrainians believe Vladimir Putin will not give ground, only take as much as he can.
We critically need to be helped with weapons, for the world to unite, for the world to help us, to be heard, for Mr. Trump to hear us, that he is being deceived, that he is being led into delusion. You can't bargain with Russia. It is not the kind of country that will give in.
It may be Ukraine's armed forces day, but it is the Russians who are on the march, after capturing an estimated 200 square miles last month, emboldening Vladimir Putin to stick to his hardline territorial demands, while President Zelensky continues to rally his war-weary country.
Dear Ukrainians, only thanks to truly strong people are nations strong, and only strong nations are preserved on earth. Ukraine will definitely be preserved, because we do not doubt your strength.
In the Kyiv metro this morning, Ukrainians were yet again sheltering from a Russian air raid, while Ukrainian officials in far-off Florida were talking to the Americans, trying not to be press-ganged into territorial concessions, but also trying not to enrage President Trump in the process, a man whose latest national security strategy no longer describes Russia as an adversary, when the mood here underground was gloomy anyway.
Russia simply won't stop until it destroys us. That's my opinion, and I think that's how it will continue. Their plan is to bring us down as a nation.
Near Ukraine's capital, the Russians hit a depot which services suburban trains, making sure that those far from the military front line feel the effects of this war. The Americans are this weekend urging the Russians to show what they describe as a serious commitment to long-term peace, though there's certainly no sign of that yet.
Well, earlier I spoke to Ben Hodges, former commander of the US Army in Europe, and Kurt Volker, who served as President Trump's special representative for Ukraine. I began by asking how alarming it was that America seems to be turning its back on Europe with this document.
I think the happiest person in the world with this document is Vladimir Putin, because this strategy cedes Europe to the Russian sphere of influence. And this is out in the open now. It's not, there's no nuance, it's out in the open. And I think that Europe better, number one, ensure that Ukraine does not fail. And number two, it better be ready, because if Ukraine does fail, there will be a full war between Russia and Europe very soon.
The way you put it, Ben Hodges, makes it sound historic and alarming. Is that what it is?
Well, historic in terms of American failure, turning our back on not only our allies of over 80 years, but also damaging ourselves. I mean, for all these years, our European allies have given us access with bases, intelligence sharing. We've served together in so many different theaters. We've stood shoulder by shoulder in diplomatic circles, and now this is the giant middle finger to that Europe by this administration, understandably making a priority defense of the homeland in Western Hemisphere and Indo-Pacific. That's not new. What's new is clearly this is about spheres of influence, and for the Trump administration, Europe is not going to be that sort of strategic interest to us anymore.
Kurt Volker, do you agree?
Well, not entirely, which is surprising because Ben and I usually agree all the time. But in this case, I think Europe is important to the United States because they want to change Europe. They want to export a MAGA political ideology into Europe and see Europe grow that way. They kind of view Europe as part of America's domestic politics, or fighting out America's domestic political battles there too, which makes me look at this whole document somewhat skeptically. It's not really a strategy. It is much more a MAGA political treatise about the way they want the world to be. Doesn't actually conform to the way the world actually is. I also don't think it's going to have much impact. The Trump administration is the Trump administration as we see it. You know, we're familiar with that. We've lived with it for a year. This strikes me as kind of a warmed over version of J.D. Vance's Munich speech, which of course hasn't driven anything in policy.
Right, but it does codify, attitudes that we've heard from senior members of the administration, in the last 10 months or so. And I just wonder on the specific issue of Russia and Ukraine, does this throw Ukraine under the Russian bus effectively and therefore makes us in Europe that much more vulnerable to Russia's incursions? Kurt.
The document doesn't do anything. And it's very vague on a lot of these things. It talks about the importance of Europe, and it talks about wanting Europe to be great again. It talks about ending the war in Ukraine so that we can get on with rebuilding Ukraine and making sure it's a sovereign, independent state. But it doesn't give you any strategy for how to do that. It doesn't say one way or the other whether we should support Ukraine or not. It doesn't talk about Europe other than in terms of Europe as providing aid to Ukraine. Other than that, Europe needs to spend more on defense and become stronger and show more leadership in its own region, which is something actually a lot of Europeans would agree with. So I wouldn't worry about this. And I think if we're having this interview a year from now, this is not going to be a memorable document.
Okay, Ben Hodges, do you think then that the ball is really in Russia's court at the moment? They think they're winning. Putin has basically not given up any red lines at all. The negotiations continue, but that seems to be as much about making money as about creating peace. Is Russia prevailing here?
Well, first of all, I am very worried about this document. Kurt is right, of course, that usually the document itself in each administration does not generate electricity or cause great movements, but it does capture the mood, how this administration thinks about itself and the rest of the world. And that's why I'm so worried, because when you put it in the context of recent things that have happened, how the administration is basically abandoning Ukraine, its start point was the Russian written 28-point so-called peace plan, which is anything but a peace plan. This document does not say anything about Russia as a threat, which fits neatly with everything that the Trump administration has said and done over the past year. The clock is ticking, and usually I'm not an alarmist on these kinds of things, but now Vladimir Putin, as long as he's tied up in Ukraine, as long as Ukrainians are mauling his army, he's less likely to be able to then start attacking directly with conventional forces, the rest of Europe. But if Ukraine fails, it will be because all of us together failed, and then you're absolutely going to have conflict in the rest of Europe. And one of the examples, the inability, unwillingness to take on these Russian gray zone operations. We have not inflicted any consequences on the Kremlin. And this document, I think, is a signal to the Kremlin that, go ahead,